Well, how you doing? Hope you're doing well. I know we've been in some tough times here, and probably the topic I'm going to talk about right now is going to be very much helpful, very related. Again, why? Because we are in tough times. And the topic for today, I'm going to try to speak on a few things and maybe connect some dots. One, I want to talk about spirituality. Two, religion. And three, the use of psychedelic drugs. All these things have been in the news for some time. Before I go along further, uh, if you haven't watched my videos before, I mean, you might not guess it by looking at my attire with my Marine Corps hat on and my Eastern Eagles um, t-shirt on, baseball t-shirt. But I've been a professional counselor for 33 years. My specialty really has been transpersonal psychology, in addition to all the usual kind of traditional psychologies, if you will. But transpersonal psychology really is where my passion's been at. And that's a big title that can include a lot of different things, everything from, as I mentioned, spirituality, religion, to mythology, to what we call depth psychology. But really, for me, the interest has been as I, from a very young age, and which led me into this career path, being aware of the suffering that we all go through as human beings, and seeing that much of the suffering that we go through is really self-imposed. I've often said we are our own worst enemies. And as I've introduced that idea to people get honest and they say, yeah, I I am my own worst enemy. That's the human condition. That's the human condition. And the Buddhists say, life is suffering. And the Christians say, life is suffering is hard as well, because of this thing called sin. And a lot of folks don't really know what sin means. It's an old archery term. It just means off the mark. Taoism, the Tao, you know what that means? It means the way. And so I think what we could say from different, I want to say, this is going to get tricky in here as we talk about spirituality and religion, because it does need to be differentiated. I'm going to take a shot at doing that today. But, when we get into the wisdom teachings, and I'm a big fan of all these, what I call wisdom teachings across the board, teachings that have stood the test of time for thousands of years. To me, that's how I learn best, but I also think that's the most trustworthy source that we can turn to. And you hear themes in these wisdom teachings across the board, like the Buddhists say life is suffering, or this idea that, that we Christians might say that we have a sin nature, or in Buddhism, or Taoism, there is a way to do things. There is a path, right? And that path, call it the hero's journey from mythology or whatever, there is a path that more or less says that if we stay on it, we do well. And when we get off it, we don't do well at all. All right. So, there is no way, obviously, I can cover these topics today in the short amount of time that we have. And certainly you have to respect your time as well. But I wanted to speak into this because we are in tough times, not only because of the pandemic, but again, I've been a counselor for a lot of years, and I've always been, I don't want to say baffled in a certain way. I'm not surprised because of all I've witnessed as a counselor. But at the same time, we are supposed to be the cutting edge of consciousness here in this land, in this free world that we're in. We have all this information, even the wisdom teachings, we have all this information available to us at our fingertips instantly. And yet, what's been happening over the last decade, especially, we've been seeing sharp increases in anxiety, depression, suicide, and addiction. And here we are, dealing with another addiction crisis, the opioid fentanyl crisis. You think after all these years and all these different crises and all the things that we've experienced as human beings, we'd be doing better than what we are. In fact, we're doing worse. How is that possible? When we live in this age of information that all sorts of knowledge is instantly at our fingertips. And we've made so many strides to change legislation and to make other societal changes. supposedly to make life easier for people. People should be happier, etc. But you look at our nation, different nations in the world, and there's so much unrest, so much division, so much anxiety, as I mentioned, and it just, it's weird that would be happening. Don't you think? After all these years that we'd be in this place right now. But one of the things that I am now hearing more frequently, and again, I've been studying this transpersonal stuff for quite some time, 3 decades. And one of the things I've noticed for a long time is that society as a whole is getting, more and more separated from, I'm going to say this now, religion. Now, take this away with you right now, okay? Because a lot of people, I know, you hear the word religion, people hear the word religion, and all of a sudden they start to become defensive. They get in a defensive posture, and they want to start getting into a debate about this and that. One of the things I do is that I'm what I call an integrity coach, and I developed an integrity model that I have infused into my counseling. And that is because we all want to be people of integrity. I know you want to be a person of integrity. I want to be a man of integrity, a father of integrity. I've been a family counselor for over 12 years, and everybody I talk to, they all want to be people of integrity. We love people who have integrity. But what does it mean to have integrity? Right? It kind of means, one way to think about it, it means to keep your word. It means to be one with, whole and undivided. But it also kind of means, like doing your homework. Like if you're going to speak on various topics, you should do some homework. You should get yourself informed. And words that we use are very important. The words we use and the stories we tell become very important. And the word religion, if you trace it back to its Latin, actually means to rebind. That's one of the predominant meanings of the word religion. It means to rebind. What does that mean, to rebind? It's kind of like to retie something, to resecure something. And so what it suggests, again, I'll make a long story short, but I want to give you this position on it because I want you to be informed now. So when you're talking to people about religion, you understand what the word religion means. We talk about religious discipline, if you will. It is a path of study. It is a path of practice that helps us reunite with, refuse with, if you will, something bigger than ourselves. Call it God, what have you. But the question then probably becomes, why do we need to be rebound? Why do we need to be reinfused or refused? Well, because we get separate. And this is what I've been looking at. This is first of all, this is the human condition. But certainly there have been periods of time in history where there has been less separation from us and what we might call the sacred, and now more. And I think since the 60s, for sure, there's been an increasing divide between ourselves and the sacred. Now, you're blessed if you have recognized that, and that likely hasn't happened to you. But I think, have been hoodwinked by all this technology and by affluence. That's one of the sad correlations that we often find, is the more affluent a society becomes, the more separate they become from what is sacred. And so certainly our countries have become much more affluent, and we're seeing much more separation from the sacred. How do we know that? Well, look at the murder rates, look at the division, look at the tension, look at the lack of unity. I mean, the sacred does the opposite. It creates unity. It heals things. It doesn't disintegrate things. It inspires. It lifts people up. People are getting healed. And so, anyway, again, take that away. Religion. Okay. So, because there's been so much, I guess you could say, separation from our religious disciplines, if you will, our disciplines that would help us rebind, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that people are not do not have a yearning for it. However, what's happened again since the 60s is there's been this massive infusion of narcissism, which has led to these extreme feelings of entitlement and indulgence. In other words, the immature ego is alive and well more than it has ever been in a long time. All right. I mean, we would say, and I'm sure you would agree, that narcissism and arrogance is part of the immature mind. It's an immature set of characteristics to be narcissistic, egocentric, grandiose. So those are the three things that I talk about oftentimes when I talk about narcissism: grandiosity, egocentricity, right? Are always there. There's one more, and I'll get to it in a little bit. But those are immature characteristics. That's why we all have to be disciplined when we're kids. That's why we need to grow up. That's what growing up is. It's entering into a path, a teaching, hopefully by your family and your parents, but also some of the other things that we engage in, like school and sports and things like this, that help us move from an immature state to a more mature state. So in other words, less arrogant. Well, what's the opposite of arrogance? Humility, right? We become more humble. That's a sign of maturity. But in this day and age, we're not seeing a heck of a lot of that. We're not seeing humility. We're not seeing people be humble at all. Because with humility, there's always personal accountability and responsibility. Those would be two hallmarks of what I would call true religious teaching, is that they contain personal accountability and personal responsibility leading to humility, because humility is extremely important in religious discipline. To me, that's what separates this from spirituality these days. So what I'm saying is that as people have drifted from religious discipline, why is that? Because when narcissism becomes present, remember, narcissists believe they're numero uno, like nobody knows more than them. That's grandiosity, right? And the world should revolve around them. That's the egocentricity, right? So when narcissism is running rampant, the one thing that narcissists and narcissism avoids like the plague is humility. But humility is the cornerstone of wisdom and maturity and true spiritual or religious discipline. So I hope as I'm using this word religious discipline, you're able to now see that differently, right? It means to rebind. It's as I mentioned before. So maybe not getting so feathers so ruffled as we speak about this, because we do need to differentiate between religion and spirituality. So in my opinion, spirituality, because we all have a deep yearning to know ourselves truly. And when I say ourselves, I don't mean our immature ego self. I mean what people call their best self, what some people call your higher self, your God self, your noble self. There's many names that we call it, the Christ within, what have you. We all have a yearning for that connection. And that yearning, if you will, I guess you could say, kind of is reflected in all of life. So, spirituality is what, in my opinion, is what a lot of people say they are. They're spiritual and they're involved in some sort of spirituality. But what spirituality actually is a sense. I think that's what it really is. People have a sense of being connected to something bigger than themselves, and they have a sense of something bigger when they maybe engage in different kinds of things, such as going into nature, or watching a sunset, or watching the birth of your child, but so as people have rejected kind of the disciplines, if you will, or what we might call religion, doesn't mean people don't have a deep yearning for connection with something bigger than themselves, but it's only a sense of it. Now, here's when narcissism becomes present. And so let me just inject two words here. Again, very important to understand the difference between empowerment and power. Empowerment and power. When it comes to power, guess which part of ourselves would be most interested in having power? The mature ego or the immature ego? If you guess the immature ego, you're correct, right? The immature ego is interested in power. It's interested in obtaining power that it can use to satisfy itself, right? Again, the immature ego is grandiose, meaning that it thinks it's the center of the universe. There's nothing more powerful, nothing more knowing than itself. Okay, so, but empowerment means power bestowed, power bestowed. So this is really more associated with spiritual discipline. It means that you are bestowed power. In a personal power discipline, if you want to call it that, people pursue power for themselves to use for themselves. The immature ego, the narcissistic immature ego, will want to engage with this thing greater than itself, as long as that thing greater than itself, and I use that term greater than itself. See, the immature ego would not like that at all. Why? Because it's narcissist. So it's got to subdue, or it's got to do what it needs to do in order to maintain its superiority. The narcissist does, right? So one of the ways that it does that is that it kicks to the curb this kind of religious discipline, because the religious discipline paradoxically involves humility, where oftentimes spirituality does not demand any of that. People go out into nature, they feel good. People go out into nature to de-stress. People go out into, to the gym or whatever that we often call it self-care. See, self-care is just what that is. It's often the ego taking care of itself, which is very different from spiritual discipline. Spiritual discipline, religious discipline is not for the faint of heart. I'll tell you that. But it is where the greatest benefits are. But what we see these days is that the immature ego regards spirituality almost like a smorgasbord. Oh, I'll have a little bit of this, and I'll have a little bit of this, and I'll have a little bit of this. Well, why do you want it that way? Oh, because I feel like it. So the immature ego is run by its feelings, and what it personally feels nourished by, if you will. It wants to feel better. It wants to get, if you will, kind of rejuvenated, but it's in control. See, I'll take a little bit of this, and I'll take a little bit of this, and I'll take a little bit of this, and that's my personal choice. The immature ego wants to be in control, and it wants power. Okay. And that's where we are today, I believe, as people are rejecting a disciplined religion, if you will, and settling for the smorgasbord of spirituality. It's because it's more satisfying to the immature ego. As I mentioned earlier, true religious spiritual discipline is paradoxical, and it needs to be. Take this away with you, please. The marriage between humility and religion has to be that way. Why? Because true spiritual discipline and religion results in being empowered with something awesome, if you could say an awesome power. So you're being entrusted, you're being empowered, power bestowed. So you're being given a heck of a lot of power. But that power in the hands of an egomaniac, a narcissist, gets abused and used in the ugliest of ways. So power and humility must always come together. That's how really the United States and Canada and other free places have been able to navigate that idea. Navigate being one of the greatest forces in the world, very powerful, but that power has to be tempered with humility. And it's the spiritual religious discipline that helps do that. All right. So, I've got so much to say on this, but because I want throw this in, and I said I would. I'll talk to it briefly. One of the ways that the immature ego is at work right now, again, because the immature ego is, remember, it's interested in control, power, and also immediacy. In other words, immediate gratification. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. And those are the words, that is the attitude of the immature narcissist. I want what I want, and I want it now. Otherwise, they'll be hell to pay, right? So that's why it's so important psychologically, developmentally, that we learn the importance of delayed gratification. Again, patience, wait, humility, all those things go together as part of being a mature adult and to gaining wisdom. Be able to delay your gratification. But the immature narcissistic ego is not interested in that. Remember, it wants control. So how do those things, how do the use of drugs and psychedelic drugs kind of fit into that mindset, into that attitude? Well, because the immature ego is so interested, first of all, especially when it's in pain, like the immature ego is like a dog chasing its tail. Because it has purposely disconnected from wisdom and higher knowledge, it only has itself. And so it's often getting into trouble and causing pain and anxiety for itself. And so, of course, it will never be accountable or responsible for any of it, which makes it even worse. But just to say that the narcissistic part of our personality has an awareness of that thing that's bigger than itself, but it wants to control access, and it wants it immediately. Now, our access to the divine, if you will, to what is most sacred within us, has to come through a willful act of obedience and submission. That's called humility. But because the ego doesn't want to do that, it's going to try to come at it through other means. The use of drugs and psychedelics is part of that. If all you had to do was to take a pill or smoke something or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you'd have this amazing connection with God, right? Have this amazing mystical experience, and you'd have all these amazing insights. Wouldn't that be wonderful for the immature ego, right? Because it didn't have to give up any control. It didn't have to surrender anything. It didn't have to humble itself. And it was able to do it by taking a little pill, right? So you could control when you want to do it and how it's going to happen. That is just the playground for the immature ego. And then the immature ego would then boast about having had this experience. And so that's why a lot of things are attractive to the immature ego in terms of that are mind altering. So, generally speaking, that's something that we want to avoid. Now, am I, it's kind of like, who cares what I have to say on it? Here's what the wisdom teachings have to say on it, right? It's that, and I like some of the work that's done in Christianity around this, because it talks about this spiritual warfare with something evil, and evil has only one thing, I guess you could say, on its agenda, and that is your destruction. First your pain and your suffering, and then destruction. And so kind of the Christian idea is that we should do all that we can to alleviate and avoid this suffering that goes on. And so in the Christian discipline, there's no opposition to utilizing medications, various drugs, what have you, because life is sacred, right? And so life is important. And so if you're in the process of losing your life and being diminished in some way, then yes, the use of drugs and medications. In fact, historically, the great scientists were Christian. right? I mean, it was very much on the hearts of Christian and other spiritual teachers and leaders across various religions to create medicines and ways of alleviating suffering. However, that was just to do that. It was not meant to take the place of religious, if you will, discipline, to have an authentic connection with that which is sacred, to have a authentic connection with God. So that's the, so that's, I think, where we're at. It's kind of like if somebody's experienced trauma, let's say they have PTSD or maybe anxiety or depression, and they can utilize a medication or a drug or something like this to help alleviate that, that's good. But what we don't want, right? What we do, because we all want people to live up to their potential, right? Because we are talented people, we are sacred in our divine nature. Like, we want that to come into the world. Just as us as parents, we want our kids to grow up and to be contributing members of society and to do good things. And we want to see them maximize their potential. And so, of course, that's why we get upset when people are addicted to certain things, right? Because what was once meant for maybe some alleviation of pain or suffering has become what? A crutch. It has become cancerous, if you will. It's become the person's nemesis. It's actually taking more from them than it gives. And that's the insidiousness of what this kind of stuff is like. Again, we all crave authenticity. You want to have an authentic connection with what was most sacred within you, what is, if you will, God. And that is possible. That's what the wisdom teachings offer. That's what the disciplines are about. You know, when I was thinking about the use of psychedelics and drugs and things of this nature, is that using them is like putting on virtual reality glasses or goggles. You can put those on and for a while this seems real, and maybe it's an awesome experience you're having, but at some point the goggles have to come off. Otherwise you get lost in something incredibly inauthentic. It's not real. It's not real. Also the use of not just psychedelics and things, but we have to be careful, because when we use those things, buried underneath that subconsciously, there's an implication, it's implied that we lack something. Because you can't do this on your own. See, that's the narcissism in that is almost inverted. I mean, it's a sense of lack that we might feel we have. And so we want to reach out for something like this. And all that does, I mean, sure, you can have this mystical experience, but you didn't have it yourself. It was an assisted experience. It was something was introduced, from the outside of you, like a chemical or what have you. It wasn't authentic to you, and so that's something to be careful of, because you have a deep yearning. I have a deep yearning for authenticity. That's part of integrity. And, it's built into us that we kind of want to do this ourselves. When we're little kids, we don't like, our adults always doing stuff for us. We want to be able to do it ourselves. We want to have a unique personal experience of it. And that's another thing about religious experiences. They're incredibly personal, right? They're incredibly unique personal experiences. And we all yearn for that. So just know that when we gravitate towards, especially assisted mystical experiences that are supposed to get you close to God and things, to me, folks, that's a red herring. That's a red herring. Again, for those who have experienced trauma, and if there's something useful that can happen through those drugs to help kind of reconfigure, your thoughts and your neural activity, that can be helpful, but it's far from a true religious or spiritual discipline. All right. If you look historically at cultures that have tended to rely upon psychedelics for mystical experience, they have not done well historically. They have not done well. They're usually still primitive. They just have not progressed. And so, one could say that's the beauty of the true spiritual religious experience, is that you get the best of both worlds. You get the connection, excuse me, with the sacred, but you also remain firmly planted in the world and remain clear-minded, right? Now, I will share with you a personal experience about a mystical experience that I had. I say mystical and profoundly religious, if you want to call it that. And that was through some therapy that I was doing. It was actually intended to be more of a movement therapy. It was done in almost of a Vipassana style, meaning it was silent, but we were paying a lot of attention to our bodies and our sensations in our bodies and moving about within the dance studio. And I began to really get in touch with some anger, and my breathing became deep and deep. And as I was expelling air and breathing air in deeply, and all of a sudden something hit me and literally knocked me to the floor, and I was literally speechless for hours. Now, prior to that, I had been experiencing severe anxiety. In my early 20s to mid 20s, I got hit pretty hard with anxiety. And it was a very difficult thing. If you've experienced anxiety, panic attacks, et cetera, that can really be debilitating. But I was pursuing these disciplines, and anyway, I had this experience, and it was terrifying for me to go through it. Like, it was unassisted. It was like probably like giving birth without any kinds of, any epidural, nothing like that to numb the pain. And I moved through this experience. It was nothing. I mean, as I recall it today, and this was over 20 years ago, as I recall it today, it's got my hair standing up on my forearms here and on the back of my neck, because of how powerful it was. I can remember the detail of it. And I can remember and it wasn't only in my mind, it impacted my entire body. It healed my entire body and my mind also. And as I kind of let that experience settle in, because once it settled in, the peace I was experiencing was incredible. It was a peace that I had not ever experienced, especially, in the last number of years, because of the anxiety, the dread that I was full of. And this experience was it gave me the most peace. And I moved forward in life. And even today, where my anxiety has been almost gone, if you will. And so, and it was beyond my explanation. It was not something that my ego, like, that I expected at all. It was not even something that I controlled. I was not there to have that experience, but it happened anyway. And it blew my mind and it healed my body. And I think that is more like the real religious discipline, if you will, experience, because the ego cannot be involved with it at all. It has to, boom, it has to come from somewhere else. The best we can do is kind of almost like a gardener prepares the soil. We can prepare ourselves for the arrival of something, but we can't control when it hits. We can't control how it happens. And I read a little bit about this in a book. I can't remember what the name of the book is right now, but the term that they called it was mylonic shaking. In other words, the nervous system and the myelin sheaths that surround the nerves, et cetera. And there was just this rippling of energy that had come through me. I guess some people might even call it Kundalini energy, just ripping through me. And it does happen to people who are consciously, I guess you could say, pursuing a spiritual religious discipline. And it happens like that. You can't manufacture it. It just hits you like a lightning bolt. And you can tell probably how I'm speaking this, like I said, even now, over 20 years, this happened over 20 years ago, and it's still real, and it still unfolds in me, and it's still, and again, it healed me and gave me a healing that no doctor ever could, that no medication ever could, that no psychedelic ever could. It was the most real thing that I'd ever experienced. That being said, part of me goes, my own ego goes, do I want to ever have that happen again? No. Or would I wish that on anybody? Not really, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, but I can't tell you how to get to it. I can tell you how to prepare, maybe, but that's the nature of that place there. And so I'm going to leave it here. Again, I could go on, but think about what I've said, right? Difference between spirituality, religion, a little of the context of where we've been at since the 60s, and this inflated sense of narcissism and entitlement and indulgence, and the nature of the narcissistic immature ego, how it wants to control and have power, how it would want to be able to control its connection to the divine through something that it could control, like the use of a pill, or the inhaling something, or what have you. That would be the ego trying to get trying to get a little bit of something great. But but that natural and necessary orchestration between humility and power, that's called empowerment, empower bestowed. That's power bestowed by a source greater than myself. And anytime we're messing around with big power, we have to have big humility. And that is what real spiritual discipline offers. You'll often find a ton of paradox in those places. It's exciting, I can tell you that. And again, the pros and cons of drug use and psychedelics at this time, and again, how that plays into the ego, the immature ego's story. Proceed with caution. But if you want the real deal, I almost think like, this whole spirituality thing is kind of like, it's nice because, again, nature and many other things reflect the glory of God. It reminds us that there's something bigger than ourselves out there, and that's why it gives us a good feeling. But it's just a precursor. It's just kind of the warm up to something better. And I almost feel like the religious discipline is kind of the advanced course. So if you're ready to step beyond, just kind of the warm-up phase, if you want something real, something meaty, something that's going to last, something that's going to blow your mind while keeping your head on the ground, keeping your feet on the ground, then consider a true spiritual religious discipline. Remember what I said about religion. The word religion comes from the root word, to rebind, to refuse us, to bring us back home, if you will, a reunion. Well, why is that? Because we have this thing called free will, and we can choose to ignore and deflect that, that which is the path, which is right there for us. We get separate. That's why we say sometimes people are lost. And we can see these lost souls in the world. But just because somebody's making a good living or has, a big time education, doesn't mean they're not lost. It might just be kind of what I call a pacifier for the ego. The ego is quite happy, right? Because it's all about power and control, right? So I'll leave that there with you. Thanks for listening in. take care. Take care. And, you know, again, with all that we're going through right now, uh, I think it's time, isn't it? Time to sign up for that advanced course because we need it. You know, necessity, the mother of invention. We need it right now. We need people who are grounded in real discipline. And in some of my other videos, I talk about the kind of characteristics that you might want to look for in choosing a good discipline. There are many out there already. So, uh, I wish you well, and you and your family. And yeah, just let me know how things are going for you. Leave me a message if you have any questions. You know, leave a comment. All right, take care. Bye.